Got it.
Beautiful. All right. Did you get my email with that big question I was thinking about, the one about the big picture of this whole developmental model? I'll tell you what it is again. So what I was thinking of is
refresh my memory.
Oh, okay. So I like to look at the big picture, because this thing, what I realized is it's very fluid. So, okay, so you're calling it a developmental model. So I said to myself, okay, how is it different from a belief, a mindset? Because, we have these coping skills in life that arise from our childhood, from our conditioning, from experiences, from maybe trauma. And okay, so we have these coping mechanisms that we live out of in life, and they affect who we are. Okay, now you're saying this is a developmental model, but it's so changeable. Like you could have a belief about something, and then if we help somebody, they just change their mind about it and have a different belief. Okay, where does the developmental part come in? And you said that you don't necessarily start from the self-sovereign or go up. I think you did, but you can have a little bit of each, and you might get beyond one and have some of the other. And I'm like, oh my goodness, it's
not
every
quite.
Developmental stage is full of the other one too. So why are they calling this a developmental stage? That's what I want to know, first of all.
Well, let's go back to the first question.
Okay.
So the main question you're asking, developmentally, of course, is what seems to be this person's subject-object balance. So if we just go back to these two terms, subject and object,
yeah,
object being what you can look at, have a relationship to, and subject being the ideas and assumptions that have you, that you view the world through, that which you are fused with or embedded in. So what this really is about is the person's subject-object balance. So when there is a developmental shift, what was subject at one developmental stage, meaning that which you were fused with, embedded with, becomes the object of the subject of the next stage.
Okay.
So when you talk about a belief, for example, or a value or something like that, the question here isn't what you believe in terms of content, it's how you believe it. So if you make a distinction between the content, what someone believes, what someone values, and how a person conceptualizes it.
Okay, so okay, let's say take a value. So I value telling the truth. So how I value that. So what do you mean?
Well, so whatever you're subject to is going to look like reality, pretty much. It has a tendency to look like the truth and reality and just how things are and who we fundamentally are.
So are you saying that if I believe in telling the truth and the truth is kind of two different things, but I was thinking in terms of
let me give an example though.
Okay.
So let's say that I operate from a early meaning-making stage, kind of a self-sovereign or socialized type mind, right? At this stage of development, I'm going to be pretty blind to the subjectivity behind my alleged objectivity, meaning I'm going to have a tendency to think that I pretty much see the world as it is.
Hmm.
I read people like open books. I passively receive the world, and I see it and people as they are, right?
Yep.
Now, let's say that you now come up to me and you disagree about something I think is important. You say, Jurgen, you're wrong. That's not how things work. You're mistaken. Well, if I if I'm a naive realist, meaning I think I pretty much just see the world as it is, then I'm going to see you as either someone who's, at best just misinformed or stupid or evil or completely immoral. Because you're out of touch with reality. I'm I'm
Okay.
I'm going, I'm going to automatically very easily attribute to you that you're being either evil or incompetent, or that you're just straight out lying, because you're clearly not in touch with reality then. But if I evolve a little bit, meaning mm, if
All
I'm
right.
able to if I'm able to see more of the subjectivity behind my own stance,
Yeah.
then I might be able to go, well, she's not necessarily incompetent. She may be, but she's not necessarily incompetent, not necessarily evil or stupid either. Even if she has opinions or thinks in a very different way from me, she might just have a very different operating system. She might be operating from very different premises and assumptions.
Hmm. So, okay. So I get that. So let's just take that example. So, and when you first, so I get actually even more clearer. If it's pretty much comes down to subject object, balancing the two, that's very clear. And that just clears up I get the whole big picture of that. I don't really get
No,
that.
one more thing though, before you moved on.
Yeah.
Before you move on. Now, according to the developmental theory, more people are in mid zones or on a journey of sorts from one stage to the next than are located at a nodal stage.
Got it.
Meaning there's often some movement.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
let's
Well, let me ask you a question about that.
let's say that I operate from a self-sovereign mind then.
Yeah.
I might be nodal self-sovereign, meaning there's no movement towards the socialized mind at all. That might be possible. So I'm like a caricature of sorts. But I may also be in some sort of mid zone, moving towards the socialized mind. So what you might likely see is a little bit of both, and then more of the socialized if I mature, until I finally completely enter that more socialized space, right? Then I
Hmm.
might be in that nodal socialized space. And then I might begin to move towards more self-authorship over time, if I'm lucky.
Okay. So is it chronological always?
Well, what do you mean?
In other words, when we develop as babies, children, teenagers, adults, okay, we go from that teenage stage where you can say it's most of them are self-sovereign, okay, and then you could be 30-ish after that. You could be in that self-sovereign. That's the stage we're talking about. Okay, well, how does the person get there and then move on? I mean, you know what I'm saying? So you grow from a 10-year-old, now you're a teenager. That's a very developmental stage, very clear by your behavior and how you think.
Hmm.
Okay, now you're 21 and getting older now. Okay,
Yes.
is this is
So the really interesting part here is that for a long time, we like if you go 30, 40 years back in time before, well, you have various people who kind of pioneered adult developmental psychology models, such as Jane Lovinger for ego development, Claire Graves, Robert Keegan. But if you go, let's say, back to the 60s or 50s, there was some acknowledgement, of course, based upon the work of Piaget and others, that children go through various developmental stages. That there's a difference between the typical, like maybe 2, 3, 4-year-old whose thinking is often very magical and fantastical, versus the older child whose thinking is often very concrete and very black and white, and it's not that fantastical. They're interested in the bigger, the best, the fastest, the highest. They're in business for themselves, so to speak. But there was this assumption that when people reach 21 or whatever, they're adults. They might get a bit more experienced or a bit wiser as they age, perhaps. But once you're an adult, you're an adult. That was pretty much the idea. Now, what these developmental psychologists discovered, these adult developmental psychologists discovered, was that, wait a minute, no, there is mental life after 21. Some people develop to qualitatively different meaning-making stages in adult age, but it's not necessarily automatic. A lot of people stop developing psychologically when they hit their 20s. Like, they don't necessarily become complex, but some people do. So 2 35-year-olds or 2 45-year-olds or 2 60-year-olds can be the same age, but they can be as different as that 2 3-year-old and 10-year-old in terms of what they're subject to, what they can take as object, and the kind of meaning-making system that they're operating from.
So okay, so I'm seeing that picture. So you get to 21, and now there's different roads you can take. And given it's your experience, I mean, from your childhood, or is it maybe you had a trauma in your life at 21, or because you said in the beginning of the webinar that Erickson, he said, the person, you're looking for the person that who they are likely to become. Well, maybe they're not going past the self-sovereign stage. And okay, so in terms of change work, and then you said later on, it's a slow process. Okay, let's just start right at the beginning. Now you start out, you're past the teenage years, you're 21. Now you might take these different roads. I'm not sure why or where you would choose, and nobody probably knows that. But okay, what are we going to do with this in terms of, is the person staying there until he's 70 years old, self-sovereign? Can he stay there for?
Sure, he might.
And
so
is it going to take an act of God, an accident? What's going to change this person to say, maybe this isn't working out for me?
Well, that seems to be an element of it. So one thing that's kind of different here from, if you take a young baby, and I haven't really studied, child psychological models, that much, but it seems like, young kids are kind of programmed to want to learn how to crawl and walk and imitate sounds, and our physiology kind of develops on its own. As long as we get food and nurture and these sorts of things, we will develop. Now, in terms of psychological development, and as far as I understand, no one really knows the answers to this with like a strong, here's exactly how this happens. But there seems to be, in terms of when people develop, a combination of challenge, as in, wait a minute, my way of making meaning isn't quite working anymore. Like I have to update myself somehow and support. So does the person live a life, or are they in life circumstances? So if someone, remember in the seminar where I talked about, higher isn't necessarily better,
Hmm.
but it's often a case of like functional fit. Like
Right.
what's the relationship between the kind of existential demands of your life and your way of making meaning? If
Right.
you if your experience is that, wait a minute, my way of making meaning is very adequate, like very functional for the existential demands of my life, you might not necessarily develop that much unless you're a very curious person who
Hmm.
wants to develop. And but if it's kind of working for you, it's kind of working for you.
Yeah. Well,
So for example, let's say you have an 18-year-old guy or a 20-year-old guy who's kind of operating from this self-sovereign space, and he lives in his mom's basement, and he gets supported, and he doesn't have to work pretty much, and he's on welfare, and he plays video games all day. Like if his mom continues to enable that, he might be there when he's 30. Or he might reach a point where he goes, fuck this, there's more to life than this, I better. But he might not,
yeah,
you
but
know
he
so
he probably knows though somewhere inside, oh, hello, this is not right, but it's easy, so I'm going to do it. I
yeah.
mean, so that to me would be a knowing that, you got to get that, everybody else has got a job and, a car and everything else, and you don't. So, that's why I'm saying, is that a developmental stage, or you just got caught in that? It was good and you went with it, and now it's too many years have gone by.
Well,
You know, it,
well, maybe, but
it,
some, so let's say that let's say that you live in a traditional society, a theocracy, for example, or an old communist state.
mhm.
Uh, you know, a socialized mind is kind of sufficient, because in those societies, how to be a parent, how to be a good husband or wife, um, how to be a man or a woman, or how to be a worker or a team player, like it's all provided through the
Yeah,
culture,
right.
in a sense,
Hmm.
right? So if you have that kind of, if you're socialized to the culture that you live in, and you live in such a society, that's kind of sufficient in a sense. But
Yeah.
let's say that you live in a more modern society that's supposed to be, more democratic. It might be more multicultural. There might not be like one solid church or political party or newspaper or state-run channel that kind of indoctrinates you into thinking this is the one truth or this is the way. Like, let's say you live in a society where there's a lot of conflicting information. There's a lot of conflicting ideologies about how to be a parent, how to be a partner, what's right, what's wrong. Well, in
Okay.
this,
I was
in
thinking,
this, well, let me continue
go
let me
ahead.
just, so in that sort of society, you're kind of in over your head a little bit if all you have is that socialized mind.
Right. right.
like a society like that is more likely for more people to begin to develop at least some self-authoring capacities, because you kind of better.
Yeah, I was going to say, so I see what you're saying. If you're brought up in these different places, so not everybody is brought up in the same environment, you know, living all over the world in different kind of countries and cultures and all that.
Yeah.
So definitely I can see how that would affect their thinking.
And that can also, there's no guarantee here, but for example,
Well, but two
traveling
things.
abroad,
Okay.
working in a different country, a completely different culture, for
Yeah.
example, can often be quite developmental, because suddenly you begin to look at your own culture from the outside. You have a different perspective. You have something to compare it with.
Right.
So
Right.
you might be likely to take more of what you had previously internalized, what you were previously fused with, and begin to take it as object a bit more.
Right. I mean, some people can travel and not learn a thing, and other people can travel and be totally enlightened. I've seen
Very,
that too.
very, very true. Very true. And a lot of people, like for example, there's a lot of people who live in other countries, but they spend older time with fellow Norwegians or fellow Americans, and they essentially create their own kind of copy
Right.
of home, and they do the
Right.
same things, and they're not necessarily that curious about. So
Right.
there's no guarantee. There's no, but
Right.
living in a different culture and being exposed to it can be, for quite a few people,
Yeah.
uh, a kind of developmental nudge.
Hmm. So, two things that you said in there that stood out for me. So, one is um, we're studying this, so we're looking at this, and other people have obviously. But
Yeah.
this isn't a conversation that I've had with anybody else in the world, or anybody would even know what the hell I was talking about. Now, okay, so you're out in the world, you're living your life, and you're with a self-sovereign person, and you're self-authoring. You know, you don't even know for these developmental models to save your life, and
Yeah.
so you're always in like conflict, like what the hell's going on with this person? I mean, this is craziness, crazy making to me. Now that I am seeing this, I'm like, how do people even deal with people when they have no clue about this, the way that people can see the world? I mean, that's the first thing that just struck me when you were talking about that. And then the
Yeah.
other thing you said was, you even said it in this webinar, it's not necessarily better. Well, that's got that thing that got me thinking, because that I was thinking that it's better the next stage you keep going to, because for me personally, it's like I'm not going back to those other stages, number one, and it made my life so much better. I mean, why wouldn't anybody want to have more perspective on different things and how you see something? I don't know. To me, it's like a no-brainer, but I guess to a lot of other people, nobody cares. So I
Yeah.
guess I was thinking, yeah, that's where I was trying to steer all my clients, because once I learned that, I'm like, okay, this is a good place to go and get you to go. And now
So
you're saying, well, not necessarily. I'm like, well, okay. So I'm looking at that, but I still don't understand who wouldn't want to be, have a higher perspective on life. I don't know, but that's just me. So
yeah, it's. I think I like to call it like the myth of the stairway to heaven model. That's very often sold in a lot of like personal development courses. Is
yeah,
like
I like that.
you can become issue free, like you can land, you can like there's this stairway to heaven, right? And now on the one hand, I would say that higher is generally better, because you're less reactive, you have more perspective. It's a richer model in a sense. So
Yeah.
in one sense, higher is better. But on the other hand, it's a bit like saying that being a teenager is better than being a child or being an infant. It's like like people.
I know. I read that
You
example
know,
that you gave.
and also depending upon the life you're living and your existential challenges. So one point I tried to make in the seminar is that all psychological growth also involves losses. Like there are losses associated with maturing and growing psychologically.
Mhm.
For example, people who operate at earlier stages are often way more certain and convinced in their opinions and perspectives because they don't really have much perspective on them. They think they essentially just see things as they are, right? So getting a more complex and nuanced and seeing more shades of gray where one previously saw black and white is enriching and liberating in many ways, but it can also come with a loss of that certainty of knowing how things are and necessarily knowing what's always right.
Mhm.
No, like
So,
if you look at, for example, some religious people who have been very socialized into some fundamentalist belief, they have, you know, they know exactly what the right thing is because it's dictated in their holy book, and they have this is the meaning of life. This means this. This is right. This is wrong, and that can provide a great sense of meaning and stability and purpose and security and knowing one's place and belonging to something bigger and all sorts of stuff. But let's say you suddenly begin to, let's say a person like that moves abroad or has some experiences in life, and they begin to take a step back from a lot of this stuff, and they go, maybe this isn't necessarily that true, all of it. Maybe it's just a perspective. Maybe this is just one way of looking at things. Like, oh my God, shit, but what's right then? And what should I do? And like that can be like the person has matured in one sense, but it can kind of feel like getting the rug pulled out from under them because they haven't necessarily learned to deal with ambiguity and paradox and
right.
stuff like that. So there might be a tremendous sense of loss in certainty in meaning, that might lead to depression. Like I used to know what was right and what was wrong and the meaning of life, and now I'm kind of confused. I've lost my way, and a person might become nihilistic and cynical, and this is where having a coach or a guide that, instead of just trying to slam them back into their old black and white thinking,
Yeah.
perhaps can help them
So,
navigate that
okay, so
new
that's
space.
the question I have is, okay, so if you get someone like that and you see that, okay, they've got this black and white thinking and you get the whole picture, and now you know so what direction would you take them? Would you, because like you say, they may not even understand what you're talking about. I mean, this is the part I'm not really sure they can understand. If how could they go from, say, self-sovereign, and they come in for an issue, maybe they've got a phobia of going over a bridge or something, you know, and you get talking to them and you realize who's sitting in front of you. And they have depression too and all that. I mean, okay, do you make a decision? What am I going to do? I'll just help them with the phobia over the bridge and keep to myself what I know. I mean, I don't know. Is this a crazy question, or you know what I'm saying?
Well, if someone comes in with a concrete phobia and that's what they're interested in, I'll do my best to help them with that. And for some issues, their developmental stage might not be that interesting, in a sense. But then there are other so like I said, for example, feeling true guilt, for example. People who operate from a more self-sovereign type mind don't really feel guilt.
Yeah,
They don't
yeah, I
they
got that
don't really,
example. Yeah.
they don't really feel, they don't really have guilt or empathy. I mean, they do have some empathy. I'm not,
Yeah.
but when you push them a bit on, they say they're guilty, and you kind of go, well, what do you mean? Or how are you guilty? Or how, well, I'm worried now that she found out, what she's going to do. She might leave me, and I'm worried about that. It's more this, I'm
Hmm.
worried about what the other person might do to me now that they know that I
Yeah.
said that or did that type thing, right? But the
So
person,
would you try to show them about how they're perceiving guilt? I mean, that's very different from another person who actually feels guilt in a different way. So this is a good point. So say if you've got, a husband and wife, or a husband comes in first, then the wife comes in, and you see one's self-authored and the other one's self-sovereign. And they're both coming from
that
different
that
places.
that's going to be rough. That's going to be a very rough relationship. I'm not necessarily talking about like a sexual encounter or a short-term
Yeah.
play,
Hmm.
but a relationship like over time, with like an intimate relationship between like a self-authored and self-sovereign. That sounds close to impossible.
And so going back to my earlier comment, if they're in the world, they have no idea about developmental models and all this, and there they are in life. I know a lot of people like this. They have no clue. They're in different worlds, these people, and they're married for years, and they have all these conflicts.
Yeah.
So this is they go to these therapists, they go to marriage counselors, they talk, nobody's talking about this developmental model of subject, object, and how you see things.
Yeah. So,
Okay, which I find to be kind of strange. I mean, if they've figured this out and someone's come up with this, how come we're not using this to show people, okay, and maybe perhaps you're looking at the world like this. Could this be possible? And maybe, I mean, if we're supposed to be using this in helping people, do you know what I'm saying?
yeah.
So
I
can't. So I guess what I'm saying is, it's really difficult to have a person see that they're living through this developmental model of sovereignty or socialized or authorship if you're not open to looking for that.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, when I work with people, I don't talk developmental psychology with them. I don't teach them this
Right.
model. It's more this kind of map in my head that I kind of orient to a little bit in terms of like, what do I ask of my clients? So for example, let's say someone comes in and they say, I have conflicts with my wife. We're fighting. We're having conflicts. Well, if the person wants to explore that with you, the very interesting thing is like, well, how do they conceptualize conflict? Like, if you really talk about their conflict, then what they mean by conflict, and so for example, someone who operates from a self-sovereign mind, the conflict is external. They don't really have a psychological self. They don't really self-reflect, right? Because if I'm if I'm fused with my enduring perceived needs and interests, right? I'm going to see, if we have a relationship, then I'm going to see you as a supplier to the self.
Mm-hmm.
So from my perspective, it's like I scratch your back, you scratch mine. The relationship, from my perspective as a self-sovereign mind, is likely to be very transactional.
Mm-hmm.
It's very transactional. So the conflict. So for me, then, conflict is external, meaning you're not giving me what I want.
Mm-hmm.
You're not doing what I think you should do, or you're getting in the way. If only I can get you out of the way or get you to do what I want, the conflict solved. Now,
Right.
if you push the person a bit and you talk to you might invite more complexity. But if the person's truly operating at a self-sovereign mind, that's where the buck stops. What they don't have is a feeling of mutuality or shared meaning or that deeper sense of intimacy.
Right. So,
They're not motivated by abstractions such as loyalty or commitment. Like it's not really. So, but as I mature and develop and get more perspective, you know, conflict isn't just external anymore. It's also more increasingly internal.
well, I guess
I
that's the question I have is how do they, you say they could be that way at 70 years old. What's the thing that's going to make them, as they mature, develop? I mean, I know for me it was trauma, conflict in life, and dealing with situations that were not good. I mean, I learned from those really quick. Some people don't. Some people maybe escape into alcoholism or, you know, let's look on the positive side. What's the thing that could get a self-sovereign person to mature and grow and change? Because I mean, that's not such a fun
life circumstances that kind of demand more of them than what that self-sovereign mind provides. So if we look naturally in life, if we take away therapy and change for it for a moment,
yeah.
if we look at, like, when do people tend to grow into this socialized type mind to some extent? Well, very often, like, late teens, early 20s.
Mm.
Uh, if you get a client who's 25, the chances that he or she is fully self-authoring is really slim. You might get an occasional one, but it's
Yeah.
rare. It's rare. Now, if you look at like the typical face, so for a lot of people, what might help socialize them is going into the army. They become part of a troop. They internalize the values of the army, and they become part of their squad or troop, and the troop becomes part of them. Or it might be being part of a sports team and really becoming a team member. Like I'm a part of this soccer team, and the soccer team is a part of me. Or it might be internalizing religious teaching or a political ideology or a particular
Got it.
education. Like
Yeah.
someone goes to college and they become a sociologist, or they become an engineer, or they become an economist, and they kind of internalize, and they become an economist. They are a sociologist. That's who they are. They've
Right.
internalized that, right?
Got it. Yeah.
So it's me and my peers. It's me and the other engineers. We're like this. I'm proud to be an engineer.
Yeah, yeah.
And we engineers are a bit better than the rest of you.
Yes, yeah, that's clear. So that clears
So,
really up for me. So I see.
if you look at Ericsson's work, though, since we mentioned him earlier, like
Yeah.
Bandler used to criticize him and make fun of him because he said, "Oh, with Milton, it was always about, cut your hair, like get a job, get married, have kids, and buy me presents, right?" But there was probably some sort of wisdom in it because entering into a long-term relationship, and I'm not saying that that's always going to work, but
Yes.
getting married and having kids, that's gonna. So
Oh
there's
yeah.
a lot of, but there's a lot of people who operate from mostly a self-sovereign mind who have kids and are married, unfortunately, and they're usually not good parents, and they're usually not a good partner because that mindset is not really sufficient to be a parent or to be an intimate partner, right?
Yeah.
But for a lot of people, uh, getting into a committed relationship, having kids, that kind of forces them to upgrade from that black and white egocentric,
Got
I'm
it.
going to put my kids' needs first, the family, this
Yeah,
is who
yeah.
I'm, you know.
Got it. That really clears it up for me. So what you're saying is, okay, you get to be a teenager, and now things start happening. Existentially, life is happening. College, maybe you would get married right out of high school. So things, are going to have the possibility of changing you or not. So you have this capacity if you're curious enough, or if you're engaged enough, or whatever variety of reasons. So you may come along even further and mature, or you may not. And then you have other circumstances as the years go on. So I get it. That's really, really clear. So I can see how, yeah, one person may not be, maybe a father ahead of the other one because maybe they got married and had, quadruplets or something right away or something. Who knows, or somebody had a death in the family, or things can affect your life. So you could go on. Now, is that what you meant by having multiple perspectives? Is that what you mean? Like lifestyle kind of things happening, or belonging to a group? Is that what you mean by that? Holding two perspectives at the same time? I wasn't sure what you meant by that.
Well, the kind of self-sovereign mind can hold multiple perspectives, but one at a time.
Okay, I'm not sure what you mean by that. What do you mean?
Well, what I mean by that, I just made a video, by the way, on my YouTube channel a couple of days ago, where I talked about, for like 10 or 12 or 13% of the adult population, becoming a suicide bomber would be a developmental achievement. Because someone who operates from a kind of self-sovereign mind might be a street thug, might be a gang member, might be involved in petty crime and stuff like that. But he's not going to be a suicide bomber. He's not going to be motivated by abstractions. Like if you truly are a suicide bomber, you have to internalize certain religious beliefs, and you have to kind of co-construct your very sense of self based upon how well your behavior seems to cohere with these religious beliefs, right? So
Yeah.
if you become a fundamentalist jihadist or something who acts on behalf of God, or engages in holy war, like you're motivated by an idealism of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
There's loyalty. There's being part of something bigger. There's meaning. There's us against them. You see, like for example, with the self-sovereign mind, it's essentially me against the world.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
it's a win-lose orientation. It's a
Mm-hmm.
dangerous world out there. It's me against the world, pretty much. The great strength about the socialized mind is that suddenly there's an us.
Mm-hmm.
It might be us therapists, us psychoanalysts, or us engineers, or us Christians, or us, Republicans or progressives, or Americans or Norwegians or whatever. It's us against them. So here you might get more of the nationalism, the patriotism, the loyalty, the my country, right or wrong, support the troops no matter what, like that sort of. But of course, the downside to this too is very often that kind of loyalty, this tribalism, this the obedience. If you look at Nazi Germany, or you look at, like, if you're not part of us, then screw you, essentially.
Right. Yeah, which is a lot of that going on.
Now, the paradox is, if you had a society or a culture where people were more self-authoring, it would likely be more individualistic in a sense, but it would also likely be more we-oriented in a principled way. Meaning, so if you look at, like, ideas such as, universal human rights, freedom of speech for all, rule of law, like putting the individual, revolving the rights around the individual, like irrespective of skin color and religious beliefs or gender, or this, that would be a more self-authored likely way of,
Yeah, got it.
like, less tribalistic in one sense.
Yep. I got that. So okay, so
but imagine this. Imagine that you're living in a very traditional society, culture, family, workplace, whatever, and you've developed pretty strong self-authoring capacities. Like, you might not be too happy there.
Yeah.
I'll give you I'll give you
That
an
reminds
interesting.
me of when you said the self-transformational, the last paragraph, you said something about the emperor's new clothes. That was my favorite story as a kid. So when you just said that, I'm like, I kind of got hypocrisy like really early on, like 6 years old. So, I mean, can some of this stuff start, that young, you start to see things, but you don't act on it, of course, because I was in a family, you had to do what they said and went on with life. But, I love that story. It's like, yeah, I got it. They kept trying to tell me there was a Santa Claus, and I just couldn't understand why they kept lying. I didn't understand it. But anyway.
I had this is a great example for me. I worked with a client a few years back, and I can't remember how we got into that discussion, but he told me about something that had begun to really bug him in the last few years. And in the past, it was not an issue. It was not much of an issue for him. He was like a lay judge in this court case. So you have like a main judge, and then you have like two lay judges, right? And he was one of them. And he found he had been very dubious about, is this guy really guilty? Like, the evidence here don't seem to be good. Like I'm very uncertain about this. And then the main judge we just have to convict this guy. This guy's guilty as sin, and just like hammered that home. And he was like, well, okay then. And he just kind of signed it, which the other person did as well. And it kind of bugged him a little bit at the time, but he was a bit like, yeah, but the judge probably knows best. He's experienced, and I just kind of followed orders, and it's not really for me to, blah, 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 blah. And then, like, 10 years later, it starts to bug him. Because now he's way more self-authoring in his mind, and he's going, for fuck's sake. I was responsible for that. I should have stood up. I should have said no. But at the time, he was just kind of following orders, and the judge knows best, and it kind of didn't feel right, but it wasn't that big a deal to him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But 10 years later, it's like, this is bugging me. This is really bugging me that I said yes to that, and that I didn't exercise my authority, and that I didn't protest, and you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
So
mean, that's why I'm saying this thing is very fluid. I mean,
so you might, you might then, if you live in a society or group or a company or a culture or a family where, let's say, everyone's just kind of going with the flow with something, and you might be the one who has perspective enough to kind of go, you know what, this is kind of fucked up. Like, I'm not okay with this. Like I'm gonna raise hell about this, or I'm gonna plant my flag here, and the others might resent you for it and get
mhm.
furious. They don't want to, you know. I mean, development too can have, you see this also sometimes in some couples. They might have been together for many years, and then one of them kind of begins to question things and begins to learn new things and begins to challenge and as a result of that, the whole relationship is now at risk. Used to be pretty good. Now it's really,
Yeah,
so development might lead to a divorce. It might lead to someone no longer being happy in their job.
right,
So
right.
one thing I've had for quite a few people is that, let's say they've been successful in business, they've made money, they have all the trappings of success, and they evolve psychologically, and they begin to self-reflect more on things. They get more perspective. They begin to more author for themselves what it means to be successful in life. And suddenly they go, you know what? I have this money, but how did I earn it? Like suddenly perhaps ethical business and what I'm contributing to, and suddenly becomes a big issue for them. Whereas 10 years earlier, it wasn't on their radar.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like they couldn't have, like they wouldn't have even thought to think about it.
Yeah, so it's kind of naturally evolves. I've noticed that over usually about 10-year spans. All of a sudden that idea comes, it's just not even consciously sometimes like, okay, what's up? Reassessment time. Am I still into this, or what's this about? Sometimes it takes a lot of time to be engaged in something.
Yeah.
And then
And of course, sometimes people can just change their mind too about something without necessarily having developed in a kind of subject object way. They still have the same thinking style. They've just changed a belief.
yeah,
So
yeah,
so 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 someone might be a fundamentalist Islamist, and then they become a fundamentalist Christian, for example, or a fundamentalist Marxist.
mm-hmm.
They changed their belief, but the same meaning making might still be operating.
So what I'm getting, so it's the subject object and the meaning making is the basis, sort of the foundation of all of this to look at.
Yeah,
Is that what you're saying?
yeah,
Because you could have a client, if you look at the bigger picture and you see they're self-sovereign or self-authoring, and they come in for a bridge phobia, say, they may not want to change their whole world.
no,
They may just want to have the bridge phobia taken care of. But
right,
it would be
right.
up to us to sort of gauge or maybe throw something out there to see if they want to bite or not. If they don't, okay.
It completely depends upon what they want and what they're in for. So if someone just
Right,
has a
right.
bridge phobia and you can help them with that, or they want to stop smoking, great. and you might still kind of, if they're kind of self-sovereign, you probably better be more action-oriented and concrete in the way you deal with them, not
Yeah.
be too abstract, right? Because
Right.
you're
Right.
not
Right.
used to it. So,
Yeah.
so it's a bit like, what am I asking of my client? How are they making meaning? It's still relevant, but sometimes in life. So let's say, for example, I remember my father used to. He and this one other engineer, they designed the first like ferry or boat in the world driven by natural gas, like as engineers. So he's been hired to oversee projects of people building these types of boats in different countries, and he went to Poland. He did like a project there for many years. And one of the things that struck him was like they were often very good workers. And now I'm speaking very generally, of course, as long as the tasks were very well defined. But if you would ask people, why don't you hook up with those and negotiate this? But that's not my job description. No, but I'm asking you to kind of create your own job description.
Mm-hmm.
He used to say initially, because over there, the bosses would eat one place, one table, and the workers somewhere else. And he would turn up in like jeans and a t-shirt and go down to the docks with the guys and go out on the boat. And initially they would go, he's a spy.
Yeah.
Speak to him as part of leadership. And then after a couple of months, they kind of realized, no, he's Norwegian. He's weird. He's different. It's a different. It's a different ball game. But let's say, for example, that someone works in a company where their role has been very well defined and they act in accordance with that role. But let's say that they've been promoted and now they have to do leadership and they have to deal with conflict, for example, and they describe being teared in half by these, where suddenly they might have to like develop a vision for themselves on how to lead or how to do things, and they're completely lost because that kind of socialized mindset that was sufficient as a team player
Mm-hmm.
may not at all be sufficient to lead, to develop a vision, to set boundaries, and so now, for this particular person,
Yeah.
you might work on authoring expectancies and boundaries and your inner authority and that sort of, like, very relevant.
Yeah, I was going to say, what would you do for that person then? Would you just focus? So it seems to me you would ask questions about how they're doing the conflict, how the conflict is showing up for them, and what
Yeah.
that's creating in them.
And to invite more perspective and to invite authorship, like for them to write out their own definitions, which often, so your job will often be to like function a bit as their self-authoring mind as they develop it. So you kind of remind them that hey,
Yeah, that's a big leap for them.
So for example, one thing I see very often in relationships and stuff like that is that people might say, well, I should be able to expect that of my mother. She's my sister. She should have my back. My husband should understand. My kids should be grateful. And people have a right to their experience, right? But if they're suffering and struggling and they're asking for help, for these people, it very often looks as if those expectations they have are embedded in the relationships. She's my mother. I should be able to expect this. She's my sisters. Sisters do that, or he's my son. My father should respect my decision, right? You get this. And if you speak to them and you kind of, they're often subject to this. It seems as if because she's my mother or my sister, I should expect this and they should. And if you then, for example, can begin to challenge them of, wait a minute, or are you noticing how you are kind of projecting these expectancies into the relationship? Like this idea that they can kind of re-author their own expectancies, that they can change their expectations, that they can set boundaries, that they can decide for themselves what something means to them. These ideas are often alien to them. But if you introduce them and you guide them, so one exercise I do a lot for clients is I have them write down their most important expectations for the other, whether it's their mother or their son or whatever, right? And I say
Yeah.
it's really easy to discover because you just look at when you're the most triggered. When do you get really reactive, right? And if you then kind of do the math backwards and say, okay, for me to get that reactive when she says that, what expectation is she violating? Oh, so I'm likely expecting this. Okay, so I'm expecting this, this, and this. So I get them to write it down. Ah, this often turns something they were subject to into something they can look at. And discovering these expectations, these are thoughts that they're not inherent in, great. And then I ask them, so the basis for these expectations, to what extent do you use yourself as a reference for these expectations, or your family religion, or what you've been taught? And to what extent do you base the expectations on the other person's behavior over time? They go, huh? I say, because the trick is, when you design expectations around other people, you want to use their behavior as the guide, not your own personality tendencies or your own internalized ideas of how things should be. So, for example, I had this client who had done quite well financially, and his brother hadn't, and his brother was kind of irresponsible, and he would ask to borrow money, and then if my client said no, he would get really angry and give him a very hard time. And if he said yes, he would usually have to haggle a lot to get the money back, and usually not all of it, and it would take extra time. And he had this, my brother is 40 years old. He has to take responsibility for his life. I said, well, look at his behavior. Turn off the tape. How is he acting? And he kind of, well, he does that. He asks for money. He gets angry when I say no. And if I say yes, he pays 80% back 6 months later. And I have to, okay. So in that case, you want to expect that he's going to ask for money, get really angry if you say no, and then pay most of it back 6 months later than he promised. Because that's what he does. And then you get to decide whether you lend him the money or not. And what's going to be your criteria? How will you make sense of this? So that's one. So for example, whether it's to be successful, or to be a good parent, or to be a good person, well, what are your criteria? What criteria are you operating by? Well, notice when you get triggered and reactive. That lets you know what expectancies you have. Write them down. Look at them. What do you think is workable here? You're challenging that And also boundaries. Like I very often kind of create this distinction for them between my business and your business psychologically. What I think, feel, value my business, what you think, value your business. Well, start to notice when you get emotional, ask the question, whose business am I in? My mother should be honest. Ah, I'm in my mother's business again. Can I come back to my business and be honest about the story that my mother should be honest? So
Mhm.
it's like these sorts of tools. Very often, it's kind of a shock for people when you can kind of suggest to them that they can write their own definitions of things to some extent.
So does this play into what do they take responsibility for?
Yeah.
So is that what you mean? So they're taking so they're not taking
So
responsibility.
so so given that my brother acts like this, well, if he gets worse, I'll adjust my expectations based upon his behavior. If he improves, I'll adjust my expectations based upon his behavior. But what type of relationship do I want to have with my brother? On what terms? That's a more self-authored.
Right, right.
You're kind of inviting that. Might be no relationship, might be some relationship.
I guess what I was saying so what do they take responsibility for? I was thinking in terms of um, my thinking that I'm angry at my brother. I mean, he's just being himself, doing his thing. So I'm not taking, I'm taking responsibility for the fact that I think he should be doing something else.
Yeah.
Is that, am I off?
That's a more self-authored perspective. But if someone's more socialized, they're not going to naturally think that way. But
Right.
but you as the coach, if you have those capacities, can kind of introduce that to them and train them and challenge them and hold that up for them
Well, let
and
me ask
help
this
them
crazy question. What if I wasn't? What if I'm a self-authorizing therapist and I get a self-socialized, and I get the two of you, they get the client self-socialized and the therapist self-socialized. Where are they going with
one more
that?
time. I didn't quite catch that
If
one.
you're
What
both
did
the
you
same, in other words, if the therapist is not self-authoring, say I'm a self-socialized person, I'm a therapist. And
Yeah.
now you get this guy, the brother, he's talking about his brother, and the client is self-socialized.
Hmm.
What do they do?
Well, do you know how you kind of discover the kind of socialized person in a sense? Largely, I mean it's very often poor boundaries. They're usually simultaneously under responsible and over responsible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
yeah.
so on the one hand, so I mean anyone can say, look, you're pissing me off, you're driving me nuts. People can talk like that from any system. The socialized mind truly believes it.
Right.
Even if you kind of challenge them on it, they don't see how they're constructing their experience, how they're making the meaning. That they're subject to that. They don't see it.
Mm-hmm.
She makes me, she makes me angry. She makes me sad. So there's this simultaneous, often kind of victim thing going on where they hold other people directly responsible for their inner experience. My father doesn't respect my decision to not be a lawyer. Therefore, I'm deeply depressed and I feel like his lack of acceptance makes me feel unworthy as a person, right? But it's also this, if we're in a relationship and you're not happy, well, I should make you happy. So I feel directly responsible for your lack of happiness.
Mm-hmm. So how do you nudge a person off of that stance? I mean, so do you go into the
You
conflict?
you you might teach them REBT. You might introduce them to like an ABC model and go, look, A is the event, C is what you feel and what you do, but there's a B. And the B is your demands, your expectations, what you're attributing of motives. So what do you think, you can kind of teach them and begin to get them to look for it. To say, oh, okay, my father says you should have been a lawyer, and I'm sad. So what? So what am I? Well, I'm kind of demanding that my father must accept my decision. And then I rate myself as no good as a result of that. And I rate him as a bad person. And that's kind of what I'm doing. Well, let me look at these thoughts and maybe challenge them a bit or relate to them differently. Oh, now I feel different when he says that because I'm doing something different in my mind. You're kind of helping the person to see, wait, yeah, he might be saying that, but what are you doing internally as he's saying that? You're now people are often looking for the powerful technique, and you might meet them there, but the trick is, of course, to help them to see that it's not really the technique, it's what they're doing. It's how they're making sense out of the instructions. So the socialized therapist, might be operating from, might be a psychoanalyst, might be an NLPer, might be but they usually follow protocol, and it's usually the technique, the technique that does it, and the
I mean, a person who's been a self-sovereign person, say they're
and
70 years old.
The client too, who's more socialized, will often be, not always, depends on their beliefs, but they might be more into credentials and papers and are you licensed and that's sort of, it's kind of borrowed authority through versus. So for example, if you take, I used this example with someone the other day who I'm kind of mentoring, like let's say you're a doctor and you operate from that kind of more socialized mind and you're the expert as the doctor, and you expect the client to kind of be the sick and stupid one, and you're going to give them the diagnosis and tell them what to do. And if you have a socialized mind who believes in that, they're going to be happy with that because that's what they're looking for. They're looking for an expert to kind of guide them and tell them what to do. But if you get a more self-authoring client, and they may of course be different too in terms of what they believe and stuff like that, but it will be less likely to be that impressed by credentials and titles and these sort. You're going to have to impress them based upon what you put forward, and they'll be more likely to view you as a consultant or a guide or a sparring partner. Yeah, I'm going to go to this doctor and see what they have to offer, and I'm going to judge and evaluate this. And if I'm not quite happy about it, I might go get a second opinion. I might search out these different, but ultimately I'm going to use my own authority to kind of decide what I want to do. A very socialized doctor might get offended and really provoked by that because they expect you in this kind of obedient role. So if you're a self-authoring therapist or doctor, or a self-transforming one, you might go, you know what? This person seems very socialized to me. They're looking for a direction. They believe in the authority of the doctor, and I might have to play out that role. I might have to tell them what to do to some extent, but maybe try to challenge them a bit as well. Because like that person I told you about who went to this NLPer who kind of invited her to kind of, what do you think should be done? And she was like, you're the expert. Like that was too much of a step. But let's say that the next client seems to have way more self-authorship going on. Well, I might have to be less of the doctor expert and more of the consultant who kind of presents ideas and suggestions but I kind of invite the client to make sense of and decide for himself. We're more equal partners. I know more about medicine as the doctor, but we're more equal partners. That would be like a developmental. You might tell one person what to do more, and you might offer more alternatives to the other, because you kind of see they operate from different minds, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. I like the self-authoring clients. I had
Me
one
too.
yesterday, and
They're-
interestingly enough, and looking through your notes, I saw you said you might be able to use the PIM methodology easier. And I did. I used it in a very interspersal way with this person while they were in trance, and it worked beautifully. They're like, holy schmoly. So that was, I didn't even know I was going to do that, but it was a
the
natural.
self, the more self-authored clients are often more open to psychological work and coaching and
Oh, yeah.
self-reflection and stuff like that. Because the early self-authoring person very often has that kind of expert orientation, and but there's often not that much self-reflection going on. But as people become more self-authoring, you know, that inner subjectivity, that capacity to self-reflect, to be more in touch with their inner world,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
increases. So they often see more value in exploring, coaching, psychological work, because there's a world to discover there, versus the kind of self-sovereign mind. Well, it might be, yeah. Can you hypnotize me to get smoke to stop smoking? Can
Yeah,
you give
yeah,
me a tool to change my wife? It's more this behavioral.
yeah,
Give me
yeah.
a tactic. Give me a tool. Give me a, you know.
Well, that's interesting what you just said about the self-authoring person. So in the beginning, they might be more open. So is that why um, they can read all this and be a seeker and know all this stuff intellectually, and yet still don't get it? You know, they still don't see there's, you know what I mean? That's where I was, you know, when I finally the light dawned. But you know, you see all this stuff intellectually, but you don't know, it's not you don't use it in your life.
Yeah, yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Well,
Like you can read
no,
about this no I, you can read you know, every book I have, and I've had them, but
yeah.
you know, it's an interesting
Well,
idea. I don't know what that means, but and then all of a sudden you get it.
well, I don't think the correlation is necessarily that tight. So someone who's self-authoring might not necessarily resonate with this stuff, but they're more likely to.
Oh, really? They're not necessarily, well, huh.
But they're more likely to, in a sense, because
Well, I mean,
one of
isn't that the beginning of,
one of the kind of hallmarks of self-authorship, is beginning to see that, wait a minute, things aren't necessarily inherently that good or bad,
yeah,
or
that's what I was
you know
just going to
it,
say.
it,
Yeah.
it's more, wait a minute, these are qualities that I project onto the experience. I'm a meaning maker. I create meaning out of things, and I don't just passively receive. I also create and co-create meaning. And someone who naturally begins to see that is going to likely resonate more with a therapist who kind of acknowledges that and plays on that, versus someone who doesn't at all see it, and they kind of go, what the hell are you talking about?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and I think, for and of course, the interesting thing when you look at like developmental studies and models, um, these are just how people tend to naturally evolve. I don't think anyone has really looked at what happens if people study the models and deliberately make an effort to, or with clients, you can introduce people to things that are outside their map, and kind of begin to cultivate it. That's exciting stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
In terms of, so for example, with that more self-transforming mind, if someone, so I remember reading, and I've had this same experience myself with clients and people have told me, but I recently was reading in Gabor Mate's book, the Myth of Normal. He writes about, cancer remissions and remissions from autoimmune diseases. And he interviews people whose books I've read. So this book called Cured by a guy called Rudiger, and this woman called Dr. Kelly Taylor, who studied remissions from cancer. And what they all say is that patients who have had remissions from autoimmune diseases and cancers and stuff like that, when they tell their physicians, they often, so Kelly Turner is quoted saying that people often say, you're the first physician who has ever shown any interest in how I did that or gotten curious. Very often they get offended, they shut down, or in the best of cases, they're just happy for me and say, well, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. But they're not curious. They're not. And this might, to some extent, be a developmental thing, because even if someone's very self-authored, and let's say that they're a medical doctor, but these values and principles and the whole paradigm that they're operating from, they're so fused with it that if somebody suddenly comes in and they've had a remission from cancer and they start talking about psychological, emotional, relational stuff, it doesn't fit the medical paradigm, and it probably threatens their identity to a sense. Whereas I think if someone had more of those, well, of course, if someone was self-authoring and they had an interest in mind-body interactions, they kind of believed in that stuff, they might be very open to it, right? But I think for a regular doctor, if more of them were self-transforming, they might have more distance to their way of knowing and be excited about information that seems to disconfirm their way of knowing. Like, would probably be more likely to be curious about how did that happen and what's going on for you, because it doesn't threaten their sense of self and identity the same way anymore.
Yeah. Let's talk about that transforming person. I don't know how much time you got. It's 2 o'clock already.
Sure, I have a little bit of time.
Okay. Because I mean, I only went like 4 pages of my notes. We haven't even got through it yet, but
sure, I have some time. It's
okay. So because the transforming one was the one that was kind of confusing me, because I was thinking
it's kind of confusing to me.
I'm getting the clearer picture
to everyone, I think.
Yeah, because at first, before I even knew about this, I read the 4 stages, briefly looked at it. I said, oh, okay. I got I've got a lot of those traits. I must be a transforming person. Okay. And then I do the seminar and I'm like, oh, okay, wait a minute now. I guess I'm more of the self-authoring, but I do have one foot in the transforming, because I did get, after working with you and everything, there's, I get it about the self. There's no I. Get it? I'm a selfing. I'm not a self. Very clear. But when you said you were talking, you said, well, only a few people are in this category. It's very rare. So I'm like, okay, what does this look like in practical terms? Who is this transforming person? Because as I'm reading it more, I'm thinking, well, okay, I get this, but there's a couple of things. So let's talk about the conflict part.
Yeah.
So here's what I think I get from that. That was not good news. So what I got was, okay, so when I'm in a conflict, now I want to look at the conflict from the point of view of not to solve it, as my self-authoring person would have done naturally. Now I'm going to be looking at it like, oh, how is this going to solve me, as you say this? So I'm thinking of one in particular situation that I'm looking at. I'm going, well, okay, I keep jumping into the story. I keep buying the story of the person. Okay, so I got to stop that. So I'm thinking, what is this conflict? So that's what I'm starting to look. Now I've got to look at, what does the conflict have to say about me? So do you walk around all day long and every time there's a conflict, you go, okay, what's in this? What is this about me? I mean, what does it look like in everyday life?
Well, that's a good question. I think you probably have to get a bunch of like self-transforming minds around and interview them and see how
Well,
they.
who are these people? I want to meet them.
But here's what seems to be. So if you take that, if you take the way that conflict is written about in books about leadership and management and psychology and stuff like that, the self-authoring mind is very often the first mind that can truly agree to disagree. That's one marker. Because with that more like often idealistic socialized mind, if you disagree, you're flat out wrong.
Right.
You should be canceled. You know, but this ability to truly agree to disagree, to be able to do that psychologically in a relationship or in a, that's kind of a hallmark of a more self-authored capacity, right? So
Yeah.
you can give people more freedom to be themselves, their own individuality, because you kind of have that for yourself. But this self-authored perspective is still very much a perspective that says, look, if you and I, Linda, have a conflict, that's because we're different. And if I can get curious about your world and walk a mile in your shoes, if I can visit your world, in a sense, and try to get inside of it and understand it of its own terms, then we can understand each other and learn from each other and perhaps agree to disagree or find compromises or whatever. And that's fair enough. The the self the self-transforming mind in that whole, well, the conflict is there to solve me. Well, there's this idea that, wait a minute, yeah, there might be an element of that. But if Linda and I are truly conflicted and it doesn't go away, perhaps I'm overly identified with one end of a polarity or a pole, and she's holding the other end for me.
Okay. What does that
So,
mean?
well, I'll get there.
Okay.
So it might be an invitation then for me not to visit her world, because it's not just external, but to find more internally of what Linda seems to be holding. So I can recover more of my own complexity. It can solve me. I can become bigger and find more of my own complexity as a result of this conflict with Linda, right? So what could that be? Well, let's get back to that doctor who gets really offended and shuts down when he hears about this cancer client who's had a remission, who tries to tell him what she's done, and it just irritates the crap out of him. It just shuts down, right? Well, if I'm that, or let's say for me, let's say I have a client and I get nowhere with the client, and then they go do something completely different and they resolve it. And it just bugs the crap out of me in a sense. Like, I don't even want to hear it. Well, this might be an opportunity for so the doctor is like, okay, I'm the expert, she or he's the patient. Might I be able to find more of the expert in the client? Can I find more of the patient in me? Because see, if I'm the smart one, if I'm the one who knows, if I'm the authority, I'm going to project onto you to kind of be the stupid one and the one who's sick and the one who doesn't know. And if you act that out, that reinforces my role as the one who knows. So can I see that as part of the conflict?
Okay. What if it's
So
not?
let me give you a personal one from my own life. So in my relationship with my wife, I'm something of a bulldozer. In terms of, I have a very like direct and blunt way of being naturally. Often, I'll just speak my mind. My wife is way more diplomatic and indirect and seeks to kind of avoid conflict. I'm more almost like conflict. It's kind of like a. Now, one of the things that I've been irritated at with my wife at times is like, tell the fucking truth. Be honest. Tell me what you really think, not what you want me to hear or what you. So what I would often notice was this kind of self-justified anger in me, where I'm the honest one and she's the dishonest one, because I'm speaking my mind and she's kind of trying to avoid conflicts. And I would notice that this thing would often kick off, right? It's like, I'm the honest one, and she's the dishonest one because she doesn't speak her mind. And then I went, wait a minute. This dishonesty that I see in my wife, can I find some of that in myself in these interactions? What am I not being quite honest about here? And when I started to look for that, I started to see that, wait a minute, yeah, I am speaking my mind, but I am sometimes kind of almost trying to provoke her into taking her typical role so I can feel a bit superior. Or I kind of punish her with the truth a little bit. Like I'm coming from a kind of vindictive place sometimes with it, and not quite being honest about that, not quite seeing that. That was very liberating for me. And then I started looking for, wait a minute, I'm holding the honesty in the relationship here. Can I find some of that in her? And of course, she has some self-authoring capacities, but she also has a lot of socialized. And I kind of realized that, from a socialized mind perspective, she is speaking her mind. It doesn't look that way from a self-authored perspective, but from a socialized perspective, she is speaking her mind. And that solved me to some extent. I became somewhat less indignant and self-righteous in my interactions with her. I could recover more of my own complexity. Or when you think that you are right and the other person's wrong, or you're the good person and the other person's the bad person. Well, so I'm good, and this other person's a fucking narcissist. Now, they might be, it might be an accurate, the other person may be lying. They may be, it's not that. It's just that everyone's also more complex than what we see. So for example, if I project onto the other person that the other person's cruel or evil or stupid, or, well, can I find some cruelty in myself in this interaction? How am I showing up? How am I treating the person? Am I really listening to the person? Do I really have the person's best interests at heart? These sorts of, so it's not that if you have some self-transforming capacity that you have to go around doing that all day. I think it's more this recognition that, wait a minute, if I have a long-term conflict with someone that just doesn't want to go away, this idea that I'm me and she's her, and we could like might I be over identifying with one part of the pole? Can I find some of the cruelty and stupidity or the intolerance that I see in her internally?
Mhm.
Can I find some of what I'm identifying with in her position and in her stance? So, for example, one thing I've seen, for example, if you have siblings, you have one responsible older brother who's bailing out the irresponsible younger brother, right? And it's a of course it's a conflict, right? But sometimes you might see that the responsible older brother is almost sometimes almost encouraging this behavior in the younger brother because that maintains his identity as the responsible one. They're very often kind of dependent upon each other to play out their parts.
Mhm.
And to just get curious about that, to see, wait a minute, how might me seeing you a particular way or demanding you to be a particular way, how might I be using that to reinforce how I want to view myself?
Got it.
It's more that.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
so for example, right now in Norway, there are there's quite a bit of media coverage these days because there's two of these big miscarriages of justice. People have like been in jail for years for crimes they haven't done, and they're in the process of being exonerated and stuff like that. And you see like the prosecutors, the judges, the media, like how difficult it is for these people to admit to a mistake or to say I'm sorry or to acknowledge any, like they just can't do it because their whole sense of identity is on the line. Like they're the good guys, they're the police, they're the judges, they're the
Mm.
like if
Interesting.
I don't truly acknowledge what happens to me, what happens to the way I built my identity on, holy fuck, I've contributed to like a lot of, I'm not saying all, but a lot of conflict also has this identity component.
Mhm.
Thomas Sauce used to say, a friendship is two people who've agreed to support each other's mythologies. He has this great book called The Untamed Tongue, which I love, which is full of these two people who there's something to it. Like if you look at families and friendships, it's like I have this identity, this persona I present to the world. And as my friend, it's kind of your job to kind of feed that back to me. And I'll do the same for you. And as long as we both do that, we're good friends, right? But you see how easily in friendships and families, if one person one day doesn't quite uphold that end of the bargain or begins to question, deep friendships can be lost in a day, right? Not because someone's been violent or cheated or but the whole identity thing is. And I think the self-transforming mind offers some more capacity to kind of see our own self-deception and to see how we might be using other people in a sense to maintain our own identity and to just kind of become aware of that game.
Hmm. Okay. I get that, but I mean, so I guess we all have every capacity within us. You know.
No, per definition, no.
Okay. Now that really throws me because I thought you were saying that.
Because that would be a bit like saying that if I hear you correctly, that would be a bit like saying that the 2-3 year old magical thinking child has within him the capacity to be the kind of concrete thinking 10-year-old.
Well,
No,
not at
he
that
might
age.
have
No,
the
I'm talking
capacity to,
about as when you get to be an adult.
yeah. So what the developmental models are saying are like, no, adults can be just as different in their meaning making.
Wow. Okay.
People might regress a bit under stress, during
Mhm.
trauma or difficult times in their life or illness or catastrophe. They might temporarily kind of revert back to an earlier system, but they kind of know that they've lost themselves in a sense. I'm not normally like this. I'm stressed now. I'm overwhelmed now. It doesn't quite feel like
Mhm.
me. But
Mhm.
but but no, the person who operates from a socialized mind, per definition, does not conceptualize things in this more self-transforming way.
Oh yeah, I
Just
meant
because they haven't even constructed truly that kind of independent self yet.
yeah, I didn't mean that they had the developmental capacity, but what I meant was like say everybody has the capacity to kill somebody, to be a murderer.
Sure,
I'm not going to act on that, but I don't
sure.
think.
My
But
but how do you? But this is interesting too, because there's a difference between. So let's say that you have someone who's, there are many different ways of murder or killing, right? I've studied criminology a little bit, so I'm really into murder and suicide and all these like grisly
fun
things.
stuff,
So
yeah.
yeah, but like imagine someone who's completely self-sovereign as an adult would not an inch of a move towards a socialized mind, and whose personality tendencies too might be, disagreeable and very extroverted and low in conscientiousness. Let's say you get that combination. Now you have a psychopath or someone who appears psychopathic. There's no guilt. There's no. Now this person might kill for like instrumental reasons, like might be violent or angry for like instrumental. It's not that they're reactive or defending themselves or highly emotional. they're
Yeah.
just they're just treating you as an object to fulfill their needs. They just see you as an object. That would be less likely to happen if someone was more self-transforming. But many of the most violent, gruesome murders you'll see will be two competing kind of socialized mind groups going head to head. You think about like religious conflict or deep ideological, the in group versus the out group, the kind of German, the Nazis with the concentration camps, getting rid of the Jews. That's a socialized type, completely ethnocentric. Um, the prediction would be that in general people would get less violent as they might kill for different reasons. The self-authored mind might kill in self-defense or kill for some principled reason. But in that kind of shift between a self-authored and self-transforming mind, you might get an increased suicide risk.
Why? Okay. Why would that be?
Because if your inner sense of authority and identity and authorship begins to crumble, that can be a scary place to be. Like you've been this seemingly solid self, for a long time, who has agency and authorship, and you have your principles and your values, and
Oh, yeah, I see what you're
you
saying.
kind of been fused with that. And if suddenly someone has an experience, or that begins to like really loosen, and they don't have a framework to kind of make sense of it in a way that works, it can be a very painful kind of, the rug's been pulled under me. I don't know who I am anymore. Like all is up for grabs.
Ooh,
Like
so
like,
that
like
brings up a point. I mean,
that can
uh,
be a that can so some clients, I think, who I have had, who I suspect have been in this phase, having some experience with meditation and self-inquiry and shadow work and stuff like that can be golden. Because you'll be likely perhaps the only person they've met who can meet them there and who kind of gets what they're going through. Because that socialized person or strongly self-authored, they're not going to get that. They're going to try to drag the person back into a stronger sense of self-authorship.
yeah. What's
And
the
that's what's
percentage?
crumbling for the person, right?
What do you think the percentage of people is in that scope of the neck of the woods? Because you said like 15% was self-sovereign. What's the percentage of self?
Well, they're different. I don't remember the numbers, but from what I've read, like 10 to 12 to 13% of like adults might be in that kind of self-sovereign type mind. And then you have way more people in the socialized mind, and you have the most people in Western society in that kind of socialized, self-authored mid-zone,
Yeah.
somewhere in between. And then you have some people who are kind of self-authored and more self-authored. And then you have, I think I've seen like maybe 4 or 5% are kind of moving between the self-authored towards the self-transforming. And then maybe like 1% are truly getting into that more self-authored. It's very rare, which also means that someone who operates there is like, according to Susanne Cook-Reuter, she says they very often leave corporations and regular jobs. It's a lonely place for many of them because no one thinks like they do.
Yeah.
And they see patterns everywhere, and they see things other people don't, and they try to bring this up to other people, and other people can't see it because it's not on their map, and other people think they're just kind of nuts or eccentric. So there might be a price to pay in that too.
What do you mean they see patterns everywhere? What do you mean by that?
Well, they see connections between things. So I'll give you an example of this. I had as a lawyer once, one of the more famous lawyers in Norway was a business lawyer. And I asked him, I said, have you ever studied memory? And he looked at me as if I asked him a silly question. He said, but Jorgen, I've studied law. I didn't study psychology. Now, of course, from my perspective, as a lawyer, what you're dealing with when you're questioning people is memory. So for me, it seems insane that law students can go to school for years and not be educated on memory. But for him, this was like, I've studied law. I'm a lawyer. I'm not a psychologist. So, but by seeing connections everywhere, I think if you came across a therapist who had a lot of these self-transforming capacities, they would likely see more connections between history, geography, psychology, culture, evolution, like see patterns and connections from all over the place. You'd probably be less likely to get that, no, I'm a lawyer, I never studied psychology.
Interesting.
So Ken, I'll leave you with this on that. You ever heard about a guy called Ken Wilber, this interval philosopher guy?
Yeah, a little much for me to understand, but
Yeah, no, but he has some. I think he has some interesting ideas, and one very interesting idea he has is he calls it the four quadrants. So the upper left is subjectivity, like first person experience, which is what we're doing with PIM and NLP and hypnosis and that type of stuff. The lower left is like intersubjectivity, language, cultural norms, developmental models. Like you're looking at subjectivity from the outside, essentially. The upper right is a more third person objective position where you look at the brain and you look at behavior. You might look more at nutrition and exercise and these sorts of things. And the lower right would be interobjectivity. So that might be economic systems and infrastructure and political systems and stuff like that. So one of the things that Wilber talks about is if you really want to study any topic in depth, you want to visit the four quadrants. So let's say you studied heart disease. Well, you might do the upper right thing and look at the heart as an organ and look at nutrition and smoking and exercise, fine. But you might also want to look at the lower right and look at political systems, economics, those types of factors. You might also want to look at the subjective things like anger, hostility, loneliness, how you make meaning. And you might want to look at culture. So, for example, you ever heard the Rosetto story? There's a city, I think, somewhere in Pennsylvania, where you had it was called Rosetto, and it got really famous because they had really low rates of heart disease and strokes and some cancers compared to like.
I think I read it in your book. Yeah.
Yeah, and what they discovered, for people who might listen to this who haven't, because scientists went there and they started to, well, it might be genetic, might be because the people came from Rosetto, Italy, but they discovered that the people who lived in other places were not more protected. And then they're not eating sweets. They're not, no, many were fat and they ate sweets and desserts. And they discovered the culture. It was a pretty religious place, but it was full of like rituals for inclusion and very social, and it looked like that had a strong effect on. So like if you really wanted to study heart disease, you might want to look at culture, systems, subjectivity, and the heart. Or if you looked at like any psychological factor, you might want to look at, let's look at the brain as an organ. But let's also meditate, and let's also look at culture, and let's also look at systemic factors. And I think someone who had self-transforming mind would be more likely to do that, to see connections. But if you look at a guy like Malcolm Gladwell, the writer who sees connections and patterns everywhere, because most people will try to fit everything in one quadrant. Oh yeah, it's just how you think and feel. No, it's all about nutrition and genetics. No, it's the culture. No, it's poverty and oppression. Most people are like quadrant absolutists. So when I mentor people, I'm very clear. I'm saying, look, PIM is pretty much all upper left. It's one quadrant. It's one quadrant to look at your experience. The more developmental psychology stuff is more like the lower left quadrant. You still have the upper right and the lower rights. So I remember this. I worked with this nutritionist once. This was back in 2009. So I helped stop smoking. And I used to like take the cigarettes from my clients as a ritual. And I had all these cigarette things. And she asked me, like, what do you do with these empty? I said, I give them to my grandmother. And she started laughing because she thought I was joking. I said, I'm not joking. she's 80 years old. She gets all this. She got furious because she was a nutritionist with medical training, and how could I do that? And it was such a hypocrite. And I had to know how dangerous smoking was, and how can I make my living? I said, I know all of that. And she's 80 years old, and she loves smoking. It's her best friend, it's her companion, and she has plenty of things going on in life, and she's not gonna quit. She has no interest in it. She enjoys it. She enjoys me handing her the, and I think it would be way more stressful for her to try to quit than to just continue. Now, but she had this like upper right absolutism where these other factors don't at all factor in. So when I say connections everywhere, I think a therapist who has self-transforming capacities might be more curious to see, yeah, the connections between subjectivity and culture and systems and biology and history and geography, and might be more inclined to see patterns and connections everywhere. Versus if you look at a lot of people, it's like, no, I do this. This is the framework. This is the lens. And if something doesn't fit that, I'm not hearing it. Is that making sense?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's I can see why a lot of people wouldn't want to go there. So yeah, because
and of course, if you go there with a lot of people, they might find it interesting and fascinating because they haven't heard it, so they might, but a lot of people might just also think you're overcomplicating things, and that you're just confusing and just plain wrong, like it doesn't feel right. If they have a very like black and white concrete way of thinking where things are very either or in a sense.
Yeah, yeah. It's like I was saying
So
to
to me, so like one exercise I very often, not very often, on occasion, I should say, give people, if they're seen very rigid and very angry, and they're very like ideological, I sometimes give them the task of socially arguing for the opposite position. So if they're like for gay marriage or against gay marriage or pro-life or against abortions or immigration, or they're a Republican or a liberal, whatever, I'll give them the task of socially trying to recruit someone to the opposite position and to argue for it. And they're often like, why on earth would I do that? Like, that makes no sense. And I said, well, it actually does, because to be able to do that, you have to understand the enemy's position. And if you can understand the enemy's position well enough that you can pose as him, that you can make a compelling argument for it, you'll be even more effective in arguing your own position, because you get how they go, oh, right. Now, there's also another possibility. So the self-authoring mind is usually, not always, but usually more open to feedback from people who think differently. But it better be feedback that fits with the frame and what they're interested in. So the self-authoring mind might be very interested in different perspectives so that they can use that information to better argue for their own position. The self-transforming mind might do that, but he or she might be more inclined to be excited by, let's open up for other positions and see if they can alter my position. Maybe I can put my own system at risk and have my own system changed as a result of that. So Keegan has this analogy with a car, where he says that the socialized mind will very often be kind of manipulating the world into getting into the back seat to be driven, right? The self-sovereign mind might steal the car. He didn't say that, but I'm kind of throwing that in. The self-authored mind might want to drive, essentially, right? The self-transforming mind might still want to drive, but he might also be more inclined to look at the map that he's using to do the driving and to be more to like revising that map as well.
That's good.
Because he realizes that he has a map and that the map is, another way of saying it is a self-authoring mind might be more likely to buy into the idea that I can figure it all out. I can get a complete understanding. We can get to the bottom of things. Whereas the self-transforming mind might be really put off by that idea and think of it as death. Like confusing a partial model with having a full experience of something. You know, that ability to see, look, I have my way of understanding, and any model is going to be partial and incomplete and full of biases, and this idea that you're going to land and completely get something and completely get is kind of, so to kind of come full circle, if we go back to truth, yeah, you know, there are elements where you can say, okay, let's do the DNA test, and that person's DNA is on the weapon, and that person's pregnant or not, you know, like that sort of, you know, that has its place, right? But with more mental complexity, the idea of truth might also be, well, wait a minute, like yeah, I'm Norwegian, that's true in a sense, but at one point, people went around and randomly kind of said that everything behind this mountain is called Sweden, and like it's made up, like that's kind of made up too, and to be able to see that there's a lot of subjectivity behind the alleged objectivity, like
Yeah.
partial truths, perhaps self-deception. You know, can something be kind of true and not true at the same time? These more paradoxical, like someone says, for example, you have to be open to everything. Well, open to everything has to include the possibility to close my mind to some things. So it's a paradox.
Yes, it is.
In a sense, you know, that more ease of paradox.
Maybe that's why the self-sovereign people stay there. It's like, oh my goodness, it keeps it kind of simple, doesn't it? In their world, it's kind of simple.
It is.
Like
I remember my grandmother, my mother's mother. She was simple, not retarded, you know, but simple. She had a very black and white, very simple, like she didn't abstract, she didn't have philosophical conversations, she enjoyed her things, and you know, she was functional enough in a sense, and she was happy. And I think in a sense she was kind of speared for by a lot of the things that people with more complex minds might see.
Yeah, interesting. Huh.
Like Wilbur often has this saying where he says that, look, every way of understanding is simultaneously a way of not understanding. Because the very way you understand something, per definition, privileges some things and excludes other things. It's like metaphors. If you look at medicine, for example, the main metaphor that people tend to use in medicine is like the body as a machine. That's been useful for a lot of things, but there are some things that fit into that way of understanding. Surgery, drugs, radiation. You know, you fix the knee, you replace this, you think like a mechanic. But things like relationships and meaning, like that doesn't fit into the metaphor of the body as a machine. So the way of understanding, the machine metaphor has constraints of what will fit. And if you see that my metaphors, my frameworks, the very way I understand things has constraints in terms of what will fit. So it's simultaneously a way of not understanding. Now, of course, having that conversation with a client can be exhilarating and exciting, and they might love it. And for other people, you completely lose them. They have no patience or time for.
Yeah.
No,
Well, that brings me to my last question, is because after the webinar, I'm gonna give a talk.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, just how the whole way I was thinking about this talk changed, because I thought, well, who's going to be listening? Because we had that conversation, talked about listening. And as a matter of fact, the very next day, I was hearing all kinds of things people were saying. I mean, my listening was so in tune. I didn't intentionally want to do this, but all of a sudden, I was hearing things that I wouldn't have normally heard. And I said, well, I got to give this talk. Are they going to understand? I mean, I'm all for doing the psychological illusion and you're not your thinking and all this. And I'm thinking, are they going to understand? Who's going to be listening and who's going to understand what I'm talking about? And am I good? Do I have to gear my conversation or what I'm saying to include everybody who I don't even know who's going to be in the audience?
You might, but you might also open for that. All the different minds might get something out of it, but they'll hear it in their own way.
I know, that's what I'm getting. I'm like,
they'll hear very different things, and it may all be useful. And I think as a teacher or as a guide, so two things that this kind of model has given me is I can be very judgmental and blunt in a sense. And this developmental model has helped me to be a bit more tolerant, as in seeing that it's not that people deliberately are that way. It's just these systems are kind of speaking through them. These minds that they didn't design them themselves. They're just, that's how things look. So that's one element. And the second element is, like, as a guide or teacher or coach or therapist, the flexibility to let some people hold what you're saying as truths and other people as perspectives or models. And for some people to kind of view you as an authority figure, an expert, and being willing to take the role, because that's what they need to do to be able to hear anything to begin with. Whereas for other people, you can be more like a collaborative partner, a consultant who's just kind of offering an experience, and then they make of it what they will. To be able to, like, step into those positions depending upon the audience or the person you're working with is a way of, and then you might also say, look, I really prefer these more self-authoring clients, or the if you prefer the self-transforming, there are not that many people there, but you might say, you know what, these kind of self-sovereign doesn't rock my boat. I'm gonna leave those to someone else. Or you might, but am I willing to be a guide on someone else's journey? Because someone else might be on a journey that you left years ago. But to still be able to see that, but that's their journey. And can I still be a guide for them on that journey, even though that journey might not in particular fascinate me?
Right.
So I've had young men, for example, who I've helped with depression, who are kind of self-sovereign, and I give them behavioral tools and have them do things and teach them psychological skills, and stuff like that. And they might be getting into the army, and they're happy about that. And of course, my mind is like, for fuck's sake, you looked at like who are you serving? And like, that's my natural inclination. But they're getting socialized into the army, and I'm like, okay, that's the person's journey. I'm going to leave my own tendencies out of it. Maybe if they come back in 10 years, I'll challenge the crap out of them. And they're going to say, you've changed.
That's funny. Wow. Okay, well, this has been a very interesting conversation. I learned a lot of things. I am much clearer.
I hope this was useful. I hope you got something out of it.
I did. I think I see the bigger picture and all the smaller nuance, how it all comes together and how it's just a flexible, it's almost like the waves in the ocean. Everything just keeps moving and it's just, I don't know how to explain, but
And
yeah.
feel free to please share it with these Pete and the people at the seminar
Yeah, I will. They want to listen to it.
maybe even on the PIM forum, it could be an interesting thing for people to just look at and see if they might see something.
Yeah, interesting. All right. Yeah, I'll do that if you think it's good. You'll help, you'll help.
Probably won't harm. It might.
Oh,
But they
no.
might also go, yeah, this is kind of interesting. Maybe there's, all I really hope for with the seminar was to kind of dip people's toes in it, for them to kind of see that there's a there, like there's something there to explore.
Yeah. There was definitely, well, for me anyway, definitely.
Yeah. And for some people, I'm sure, who attended that seminar, there was no there, and they probably didn't hear a word of it, like not a word of it.
Huh.
I'm convinced that there were people in that seminar who, of course, they're hearing something, but who probably didn't hear a word of it. Like, had you asked them, did you see anything? Like, no, absolutely nothing. And that's fascinating.
Yeah, it is. It is. That I don't know. Somehow I feel better when you say that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
Have a good one. All right.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.